Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. The season opener in Australia is likely to be more dramatic and controversial than we originally thought, with the FIA confirming they are going to introduce more stringent tests on what we are calling mini-DRS. McLaren introduced it last year in a very controversial fashion, and Red Bull believe that McLaren, Ferrari and potentially Mercedes are still using it to some degree this year. Testing will be done and more scrutiny will be had on these rear wing components especially. Will Red Bull get away with this? Is this potentially a step from them to try and slow down McLaren? Are McLaren bending the rules in some way? No pun intended. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. Plenty to get into today. Starting here real quick. These are all the helmets of the drivers for the upcoming year. Which is your favourites? There are a few nice ones. Lando, Hamilton, Leclerc. Kind of like Verstappen's. Alonso's I think is a classic. I like Russell's. Ocon's looks pretty fire with the setup over there. You know, maybe, Sonoda as well, pretty good as well. These were the numbers that the fans gave. The best ranked helmet, according to the fan voting they did on the website, was Lewis Hamilton's. Maybe not a massive surprise. These were the top 5 out of interest. Hamilton, Norris, Leclerc, Sainz and Sonoda. Let's just have a look at Sainz's real quick. Okay, yeah, on the bottom left-hand side for Williams. They're all kind of nice, but maybe understandably a lot of the times these votings are largely driven by fan base of certain drivers, but I think, the yellow with the red looks rather good. Now, bit of drama. Christian Horner. This time last year, he was all the rage. He was on a lot of thumbnails at the time, and for very good reason. The Horner scandal was well underway, and it's been confirmed that the deal, whatever's going on behind the scenes, it's not over yet, and the employee in question at Red Bull, his assistants, maybe had some relationship with Jos Verstappen. That was reported in the press as well. Who really knows what happens? Certain WhatsApp messages were sent, we believe, at some point, and we discussed them all last year. Now, reportedly, the employee in question is not, giving up on the case just yet. And there will be an employment tribunal in January next year. Of course, at that time it will be nearly 2 years after the original story broke. Interesting though to note that according to the Dutch press, there is what is called a reporting restriction order has been issued in England at the request of the Horner camp, prohibiting all domestic media from reporting on developments in the case. Now, I never got an email about this, so I'm assuming it's alright. But it's pretty interesting to hear. Usually it's designed to protect the identity of victims, witnesses or judges. So, look, who knows? But the reality is it's still ongoing, this drama. And we've probably not heard the last of this yet, I would say. Bit of drama as well over at Aston Martin. There's been lots of talk about this over the last couple of months. Adrian Newey is in as the managing technical partner, or whatever he technically is, basically the top man. Now, Enrico Cardile, former Ferrari man, is going to join Aston Martin as well. This is seemingly a pretty big deal because the theory is Newey comes up with many of the high-level ideas and Cardile and his team implements them on the aerodynamic side, certainly for 2026. This has received, however, a bit of a blow, and there's a couple of interesting reasons as to why. So, Cardile's left Ferrari, and there was a feeling that Aston Martin would be able to acquire his services relatively quickly. But that is not how it's going to be, and Ferrari are insisting, to such an extent they've actually won a court case over this, that Cardile will be forced to see out his gardening leave and not leave Italy just yet. So, they've won a legal battle over this. I mean, sensational images hitting the timeline as a result, but it could be a big deal for Aston Martin. I think to some extent it also shows how much of a big deal Aston Martin's progression theoretically is, and the fact that it's causing concern to some degree among other teams. Let's say Cardile was getting signed by even Williams, or certainly if he was going to, Racing Bulls, or let's say Sauber or something, a team that theoretically isn't, obviously it'd be Audi, right? But if he was going to a team like that, I don't think Ferrari might care too much. But Aston Martin on paper have built a formidable technical force, not just on the engine side, but also on the chassis, the aero side as well. Newey's first day in the team was yesterday. There's reports that he has, a bed somewhere in his office set up so he can sleep overnight if it is required. And Andrew Benson says Ferrari has won a court case to prevent their former chassis technical director Enrico Cardile from starting work at Aston Martin as chief technical officer until the 18th of July. I think initially they were looking Aston Martin to get him in the early part of this year, as early as it was actually possible. But no, they're going to have to wait for another several months, which is going to hold back their progression to some extent. Maybe this could be a blessing, just because from the Aston Martin perspective, they need to ensure that there's not too many cooks in the kitchen when it comes to their technical department. McLaren was suffering with that, therefore they had to make some changes, and that seemingly has worked out rather well for them. But Ferrari say that he was already violating the non-compete commitment with Ferrari. So they've taken it to court, and he's not going to be there for some time to come. The other piece of the Aston Martin equation is the fact that Newey only started work there yesterday. And as a result of that, they have been saving up wind tunnel hours to deploy them with Newey's guidance. And this is very interesting. You wouldn't really think of another team doing this, especially because you're also trying to make progress for 25. But it's quite clear that 2026 is massively the focus, because there's talk that effectively Aston have said, all right, we're going to backload our wind tunnel hours for when Newey arrives. So they've saved themselves hours in the tunnel, just not using their tunnel time, waiting for Newey to arrive. And they are allowed to compensate for that and recover that lost time in the following quarter. So now Newey's here, they've effectively saved up a load of wind tunnel hours for Newey to go and work on the 26 car. So I think that shows the level of commitment that Aston have, certainly to next year's set of technical regulations. But Cardile, in terms of implementing some of these ideas, was probably meant to be there already, but it's going to be a good few months on that. So Ferrari maybe have won the battle in that regard. And, you know, this may help Ferrari in the medium term and hurt Aston Martin, but who really knows what's going to happen next year in 2026? What we can be pretty sure of is that the driver lineups currently on the grid are not going to be the same, largely due to this whole ongoing Jack Doohan situation. Flavio Briatore, I mean, such an enigmatic individual in many respects, such a long tenure in multiple different industries, including Formula One, and controversy follows him everywhere he goes, as we know. But apparently he was asked the question last week, what about Doohan, right? Is he getting the drive? Is he keeping the drive? Is Colapinto getting the drive? What's going on there at, of course, Alpine? And he was asked the question, okay, like, when's his time going to run out? Like, how many races until Doohan is going to, you know, it's do or die, right? Like, he either performs and he matches Gasly, presumably is what would be required, maybe even outperforms Gasly, who knows? Because Colapinto in many ways seems such like a guarantee that he's going to be in the team, because we've got, like, all the backing from the sponsors. We've got Williams saying, oh, it's his best opportunity to get a drive. We've got sponsors, as I say, giving Colapinto loads of support, and Alpine, they probably wouldn't do so if he wasn't going to get the drive. He's got something like a 5-year deal. So, yeah, unfortunately for Doohan, the writing is kind of on the wall, especially when your boss is talking about how he controls your every millimeter, which is like a clip for the Drive to Survive thing, whatever that was. And then Briatore apparently looked at his watch when he was like, when's his time running out? And Briatore is looking at his wrist and basically implying like, it's coming soon. It's only a matter of time, which is really tough if you're Jack Doohan, right? As inevitable as it might be, it just, yeah, it doesn't seem like a great team environment and dynamic as far as I am concerned. Let's talk about mini-DRS. This was a big scandal following the Azerbaijan Grand Prix last year. It continued throughout the rest of the season, but for the rest of the year, the majority of flexi-wing discussion, and I know that we're talking about flexi-wings again, but there's a good reason for this in the ground effect era. The ground effect is complicated to make it work, to get the mechanical platform of the floor working as they intend, and the flexibility of the wings allows the difficulties of balancing these ground effect cars to be managed to a great extent, especially on the front wing. It can control the load, but crucially, the ground effect generates more and more, exponentially more performance in some regard as you go faster and faster. And when that happens, some teams have actually struggled with, let's say at the front of the car, actually having too much front downforce compared to what they have at the rear of the car, meaning that, well, the front has too much grip and the rear end steps out, and a bit of rear end instability and therefore even mid-corner understeer settling in has been a problem for some of these machines. The flexibility of the front wing, if you can make the wing flex into a position where it reduces drag at high speed, so firstly increasing straight line speed compared to what you'd want, but also in a high speed corner, it is still regressing, therefore it actually might make your car balance better. So teams have messed around with this. there's just a reason why flexi wings are such a big discussion right now, is because there are inherent difficulties of ground effect, and flexi wings is pretty much the best way engineering wise to try and resolve that issue. Now, is it against the spirit of the regulations? Sure, maybe. And for 2026, the FIA definitely want to clamp down on this and make the regulations more stable and less exploitable from top to bottom. But this is Formula One. People are always going to exploit the loopholes. And that's why mini-DRS became a conversation. We know that the wings, they bend, they flex under load. They flex more than they're allowed to, but that's because the FIA can't test them properly. They can't test them at speed. What they can do at speed is put some cameras on the car to try and get a better idea. That's what we're going to discuss in a second. Now, this is what we are describing as mini-DRS. This is from the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. Oscar Piastri maintained victory in controversial fashion by getting, we believe, an extra 2 to 3 kph on the straight because of this extra gap in the slot gap, basically, underneath the DRS flap, because it was bending in a way that, well, was technically legal, but definitely grey area and not how it was intended to be used. Fast forward to the present day, we have a couple of discussions on what it means now. So we saw this clip the other day. I would have mentioned if there was a similar clip of the Ferrari, but there isn't out there, so we're not really sure. And we're not 100% sure whether this is what people mean by the new mini-DRS. But there's a feeling that while they've closed the loophole at this area of the rear wing, they've not necessarily closed the ability to make this part flex. And maybe instead of 2 to 3 kph, this is half a kph, 1 kph, or whatever. That there's a feeling maybe that McLaren are able to, at higher speeds, allow this area of the wing to flex a bit more and therefore gain a little bit of extra performance. I would argue that the most extensive example of something that would gain you performance that I've seen over the testing period was actually from the Mercedes. Now, this isn't really mini-DRS. This is just the flexibility of the front wings that we've discussed at length happening at the rear to a much greater extent than before. We can see the rear wing in the Mercedes at high speeds. It depresses substantially under load. Now, it's always going to do this to some degree. The parts can't be perfectly static and, because they'd be so brittle, they'd break under any force. So there has to be some degree of flexibility, but the FIA want to police it, and they're not really doing a great job of it. But this was probably the bendiest rear wing that we saw, was the Mercedes at high speed at Bahrain, depressing quite significantly, and, well, presumably this level will generate you some degree of extra performance. Is it mini-DRS? I mean, I don't know, it depends on what mini-DRS is. If you're considering it something like this, then no. If you're considering it something like this that may change over the straight, then possibly yes. That's where the FIA are now stepping in, because Red Bull have complained about this. And this is what they do. As we've said before, Red Bull were kind of the pioneers in some respects over the last several years about using flexible wing technology. Now they're behind the curve, so they want it banned. And, as I said the other day, this is what you might consider to be game theory optimal strategy from Red Bull Racing, but also it indicates that maybe they feel like they're somewhat behind. If Red Bull were ahead, would they still do this? Yeah, they would, let's be honest, it's Red Bull. But at the end of the day, it feels like Red Bull are expecting to have a deficit. They've literally said that yesterday. We saw Washay's comments that he expects Ferrari and McLaren to be ahead as it stands, and one of the potential ways they could catch up is to some extent deal with this flexi-wing technology. Now, are Red Bull seeing ghosts, as it were? Like, are there complaints about mini-DRS even really there? I think, sure, on Mercedes' rear wing, but they didn't even mention Mercedes. Like, when Red Bull talked about this, they've talked about it with regard to McLaren and Ferrari. And this clip that I showed a couple of seconds ago, is there really anything going on here? I mean, maybe, but also possibly not. And there was a feeling last year, like Red Bull were seemingly kind of convinced during last season that the flexible front wing that McLaren had was providing them, and the rear wing as well, was providing them, oodles of performance. When they kind of clamped down on that towards the end of the season, it's not like the Red Bull magically was back at the front again. Like, I think Red Bull, there's been a theory anyway, that Red Bull was somewhat deluding themselves last year, that McLaren was somehow cheating the rules to gain an advantage, and actually, the McLaren car was illegal and the Red Bull actually wasn't bad. But at the end of the season, it was still pretty clear at a circuit like Abu Dhabi that the Red Bull, when it's not in the absolute perfect window, was substantially off the pace of where the McLaren and even the Ferrari could end up being. So, you know, a Red Bull seeing things, maybe, maybe not, but they're going to make a complaint about it regardless. And the FIA are like, you know what, sure, we will do some further investigation on this. Now, this saga is set to continue. The FIA, they don't really have a good solution yet. What they're going to do is they're going to say, all right, guys, we will do some more research. Now, this is always how it is with these technical directives. And I'm sure McLaren, even if they are doing something which they might get caught of doing and then they might have to change it, they might not be too mad about it because it's still going to give them an advantage in the championship. This is always how it is. Team complains about something, the FIA say, that's interesting, let's collect some data and analyse it for a little while. Then they analyse the data, they come up with a conclusion, they say, you know what, yeah, fair enough, maybe something here does need to change. And then they issue a technical directive, which is obviously backdated or, like, let's say forward dated by a couple of months. So then the teams have time to adapt and make new parts. And by the time that whole process has concluded, the team that was doing whatever they were doing has gained enough of an advantage to probably win the championship. So this is why the governance of the sport isn't maybe the best, but we've talked about it on the Ferrari side as well. They may have something similar. Again, I've not really seen any footage of what this actually looks like, but there's a feeling, I think, yeah, are the teams exploiting flexi-wing technology? Yes. What are Red Bull calling flexi or mini-DRS? We don't really know. We talked about it with the McLaren and the Mercedes a second ago. I don't really know what they've seen on the Ferrari to believe there's something dodgy going on, but Red Bull have filed a complaint about the flexibility of the Ferrari and the McLaren rear wing. The FIA has basically said, all right, we'll look at the checks, we'll do some more checks, we'll visit the factories, we'll put some cameras on the cars in Australia to get a better understanding. But the FIA have not come out and said, oh, well, you know, yeah, they're clearly doing something, it's time to go. Ferrari is calm and confident that it can dismiss the complaints without too much trouble. So, yeah, Ferrari aren't worried about it, but McLaren, Red Bull, who knows what's exactly going on here. But the story is that for now, the FIA have said, okay, to the teams, we will implement additional measures for the visual control of the rear wings from Australia. So this is largely cameras in certain positions to get a visual on exactly what is changing here and why. The article that Auto Racer put together on this says that the positioning of the cameras and related visual references to the stickers is reportedly being deliberated, as already happened last year from some races, starting from the Belgian Grand Prix. So again, it might be a circumstance where there could be something dodgy happening, but by the time they've analysed and looked into it and, you know, really broken everything down into the minute granular detail, it's too little too late in terms of making any sort of outcome. But intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Just one final thing I thought was kind of fascinating. Fred Vasseur was talking about when he decided that they were going to try and secure Hamilton's services for 2025. And apparently that date was around about the Monaco Grand Prix 2023. He even said it was on his birthday. I quickly realised that it could happen. I knew the desire was there on his side, that it had always been there. It wasn't possible on our side for 24 because we had both drivers under contract. Lewis had always had Ferrari in the back of his mind. So apparently it was that weekend when Vasseur effectively decided, all right, you know, Carlos, it's been a pleasure, but I'm going to try and get Lewis if I can. And it was fascinating. It's funny as sport F1, isn't it? Because this guy Ahmed found this article from the Monaco Grand Prix, the 25th of May, and Vasseur saying that, you know, didn't make an offer to Hamilton, right? But that was on the 25th, and apparently, according to this report, it was the 28th that he thought about it. So maybe he did an interview with the media and was like, oh no, I don't know what you mean. What are we talking to Hamilton? What are you talking about? But then thought, talking to Hamilton, that might be a good idea. And of course, the rest is history since then. But very much intrigued to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.